So the first of our modern studies source questions that we're going to be looking at today is an accuracy question. Now, in the exam, you'll have 25 minutes to complete this question. So considering the amount we're asking you to do for it, it is a reasonable amount of time. Okay, you are trying to find a decent amount of information, but the most important part of this question is getting it written down as quickly as possible. The part you get the marks for here is your paragraphs, okay? It is for picking out the correct pieces of information and correctly evaluating and analysing them. So we should not be wasting too much time actually gathering the information from the sources. It is much, much, much more important that we get writing as quickly as possible. So we'll go into that a wee bit more when we have a look at the question and the general process, but the most important thing here is that we get through the sources as fast as possible and start actually answering the question. Now this is worth about 10 marks in the final exam, so you don't need any background knowledge for it at all. It is purely based on whatever the question's about, and the question can be about, well, anything really, as long as it's modern studies related. An example in the past has been nuclear weapons from different countries around the world, specifically Russia. We've had different examples of source questions looking at women's rights in the Middle East. We've had examples of source questions focusing on different parts of social inequality and the impact that can have on things like health. So it's very important to remember that this topic that's chosen for a source question could be really specific about something that you've never learned about in class. It's not about the content, it's about the actual skill involved of gathering the data and then manipulating the data in the way that you're being asked to. So how are you being asked to use the data? Well, in this example, an accuracy question, you're being asked to evaluate how accurate a statement is. So it's a to what extent question. To what extent is the statement accurate? And we'll have a wee look at that then when we'll have a look at a statement in just a minute. But first we're going to have a look at the structure that we use, okay? So when we're writing this, overall we're going for about 4 paragraphs. The first 3 paragraphs are going to judge, based on different sources, how accurate the statement is. So we should always start by making the judgment. The statement is accurate or inaccurate because. Give me a reason it's accurate or inaccurate. We should then follow that up, okay? So we should then follow that up by providing evidence that proves or disproves the accuracy. We are looking for 2 different pieces of evidence to do this. Then you evaluate, okay? You show me why that evidence proves the statement is accurate or inaccurate. You be strong. We use words like significant. We use words like largely. We use things like slightly, if it's only slightly, okay? We make sure we are using that good, strong, analytical language to make your point and sell it to the reader. After you do 3 of these paragraphs, you might have 2 paragraphs that say the statement is accurate. You might have 2 paragraphs that say the statement is inaccurate, and 1 for the other option. After you've done these 3, and they have to be a mix, okay? You cannot have 3 accurate paragraphs, you cannot have 3 inaccurate paragraphs. It has to be 2 and 1, okay? So it has to be 2 for one and 1 for the other. It cannot just be 3 accurate or 3 inaccurate. 2 and 1. After you've done these 3 paragraphs, then you need an overall conclusion. So when you take everything into consideration, is the statement accurate? So overall, the statement is mainly accurate. The statement is mostly accurate because. Give me the reasons because. Find 2 new pieces of evidence from the sources which just once and for all prove the statement to be accurate. Okay, so 1 final, this is definitely accurate because. This is mostly accurate because. The statement will never ever be fully accurate. That's because you yourself are providing an argument against it. So you are always saying, here's a reason the statement is inaccurate. Therefore, the statement absolutely cannot be completely accurate because the balance that you're putting into the argument. So if you say the statement is accurate, you're actually arguing against yourself. So it's very important to avoid that. it's very important to say mostly but not fully accurate, or mostly inaccurate but not fully inaccurate. Right, the question. Let's have a look at one. Okay, so we will go to the 2021 past paper that we are using for this resource. Let's just scroll down. Okay, we'll scroll down until we get to question 2. Okay, so this is question 2. It is all about the House of Lords. Oh, let's just get rid of those. So you can see here, at the start, question 2, let's just highlight it. Study sources A, B and C and attempt the question that follows. We've got source A here. Then we have source B, a couple of tables, and a graph. And then finally, source C, some more information. So what we need to do is we need to decide if the evidence in sources A, B and C proves the overall statement is accurate or inaccurate. But what is the statement? Well, here it is here. To what extent is it accurate to state that the House of Lords is considered to be democratic? Right, so we are judging, is that accurate? So is it accurate to say the House of Lords is democratic? We will go with, okay, for doing our highlighting, if we find evidence that says it is accurate, we'll do it a nice kind of purple, right? So purple for yes, accurate. And we'll go with red for no, inaccurate. Right, so we need to go through our sources and we just need to very quickly highlight evidence that shows either a House of Lords is democratic, purple, or a House of Lords is not democratic, red. So let's go to source 1. Right, let's have a very quick look. In source 1, we can see that the UK's House of Lords is an almost all appointed first chamber, whose members are nominated by the main parties and appointed by the Prime Minister. Well, that suggests it's democratic, okay? They're being put in there, they're being selected, right? They're being appointed. So the Prime Minister is elected and they are then chosen. However, once appointed, they are a member for life and attend as much as they wish. That does not suggest it's democratic. Okay, that suggests to us that it's not democratic, because the fact that they're in there for life means they can't be scrutinised, they can't be removed if they make mistakes. They also do not face reappointment or re-election. That's another negative. Okay, another good reason to say, well, it's not democratic because, again, they can't be replaced. However, we've got these 4 bullet points. And in these 4 bullet points, we have appointments are reviewed by an independent body. That's democratic. So all the appointments are checked. So that does suggest it's democratic. The other 3 though, mechanisms in place to remove members. So that is democratic. The House of Lords does have that. So the House of Lords has its code of conduct. Right, so we can see here, code of conduct. But we can also see that in order to be democratic, it needs no members appointed as a result of birth. So we know for a fact the House of Lords has some members appointed as their birth, okay? And it also needs members to be directly elected by voters, which is not true. But they can be elected by a Prime Minister who is accountable. And we also have the 2015 Expulsion and Suspension Act. So there's loads of information in paragraph 1 alone. Let's look now into paragraph 2. The public opinion. Well, we can see here right now, 60% of the public think the House of Lords is undemocratic. right? So that's a majority. We can also see in this part of source B that the membership of the House of Lords is mostly Conservative, right? So it is not a very mixed, okay? Actually, over half of the Lords, right, so 30% Conservative and nearly 25% Labour, over half of the Lords are in those two parties alone. Whereas, this one here, 22.5% crossbench. That means 22.5% of the Lords have no party affiliation. So that's good, right? That means they're varied, right? So we can see right away the public disagree it's democratic, and that is pretty problematic. The Lords don't face reselection or reappointment, okay? So we can see there's lots of reasons so far to consider them undemocratic. If we go here, we can see Prime Ministers have often used their ability to appoint members to gain political advantage in the House of Lords. Cameron appointed 26 Conservative members in 2015. So we can see that a lot of people are being put into the House of Lords, okay, for specific reasons. But what we need to do is we need to actually answer the question, okay? So if we think about the structure that we are using, we would start by saying the statement is inaccurate, okay? As the House of Lords is not democratic due to public opinion disagreeing. We'll just use the most basic stat we've got, right? So if you look there, source B shows that 60% of the public disagree with the Lords being democratic. Then we need a second source that says something about the public opinion. So let's try and have a wee look for something else that we've highlighted so far. Nothing there. We could actually say this one here. The success of the Lords in meeting these democratic criteria can be measured in the public's attitude towards them. Okay, that's a pretty good statement. So if I just quote that. Let's go back to our answer. Source A shows, and we will paste that in. Right, let's just go up to, oh, we can't do that. Let's just take this here. We're having a bit of a disaster here, eh? Let's just make it a wee bit smaller. Probably unnecessarily small, but so we can see it all. Right, we'll make it small and we'll put it here, okay? Overall, both sources show that public opinion is important when deciding how democratic the House of Lords is, and the public has a majority thinking that it is not democratic. Because it is a majority. It's not really a significant majority. It's 60%. I'd say anything over 65% would be a significant majority. So it is just a majority, okay? So that is a model paragraph. We'd be looking to do that another twice, okay? So another inaccurate, it could tell us something along the lines of the Prime Minister. So this one here, the Prime Minister not being impartial. And it could compare that to this here, the bit about cronyism specifically. So we could use that quote. Then a third one that tells us it is accurate, okay? So a third paragraph saying it's accurate, and then finally an overall. So overall, is the House of Lords democratic, yes or no? And once you have done that, you are finished this question, and hopefully you've got 10 marks towards your overall modern studies grade. The next type of source question in higher modern studies is a conclusion question. Now, just like with an accuracy question, you have 25 minutes to complete this question in your exam, and it's worth 10 marks. So it's another quite big question in terms of the amount of time it takes compared to the amount of marks you get. And really, the main point of this is yet again to not show any background knowledge, but just to show your own skills. Can you draw a conclusion? Okay, can you pick out information that backs up that conclusion? And the hardest thing about this is actually making that initial judgment based on the bullet point you're given. Now, if you think of the bullet point might be something along the lines of the link between Falkirk and Scotland. You can't then just say there is a link between Falkirk and Scotland. Right, that's not the link, okay? All you're doing is rewording the bullet point there. To make a genuine conclusion, you have to add value to it. Right, so if I was to give you a map and say, tell me a link between Falkirk and Scotland, and you just say, Falkirk's in Scotland, again, that's not a conclusion. That's just description. A conclusion would be something along the lines of, Falkirk is in central Scotland. Right, you're taking the information you have and you're adding information, you're adding value. Right, that is the key skill of these questions. It's taking what you have and not just describing it, but judging, concluding, using evaluative language. Okay, that is the most important thing here. Something is greater than something else, something is lesser than something else, something is very closely linked, something has got a direct correlation. Okay, all of these evaluative words, that is the difference between making a conclusion and just describing something that you're doing. Okay, so in terms of the structure that we use for the conclusion questions, right, we always start by making the conclusion. And the question will give you the bullet points. It will give you exactly what you're making the conclusion on. So you start by right away saying, here is my conclusion. So for example, a conclusion that can be made about this is that Falkirk is in central Scotland. Evidence for this is in source A, which could be your map, which shows Falkirk is located right in the middle of the country. Further evidence can be found on Google Maps, where when you search central Scotland, Falkirk is one of the areas that appears. Together, this evidence shows that Falkirk is clearly situated in the middle of the country, and therefore Falkirk is strongly linked to central Scotland. Now, that's a really basic one, okay? But sometimes that's how basic these conclusions can be, right? We don't want to overthink this. We just want to prove what the evidence tells us. That's all we need to do here, okay? And then we make a final overall paragraph, so a complete conclusion. The exam paper will tell you what that needs to be on, but it's usually on whatever the overarching topic is. So the overarching topic might be Scotland or places in Scotland. So a final conclusion that can be made about places in Scotland is that Scotland has a variety of places, because source A shows that Scotland has multiple different cities all over the country, and source B shows that Scotland has many lochs and mountains. This means overall Scotland has a range of different locations. Again, we're just adding, we're expanding, okay? But we'll take this and we will go and look at a question. Okay, so we will go and actually look at a conclusion question. Question 1 then, in the past paper you've been provided, is a conclusion question. So you can see right at the very start, it tells us. Right, so it tells us question 1. And then if we scroll down, we can see, eventually, after our sources, right, we've got quite long sources here, we can see 3 different bullet points, okay? So we must draw conclusions about bullet point 1, the impact of welfare and benefit changes. Bullet point 2, the children most likely to experience poverty. And bullet point 3, pensioner poverty. So we can see all 3 of those options. So that's the 3 things we're going to be making a conclusion on. We can also see, right at the very, very end here, you must also make an overall conclusion on the extent of poverty in the UK. So that's what your overall conclusion will be about. So what we'll do, for the purposes of this, is we will do pensioner poverty, okay? The reason I've done these in 3 different colours is because when you're highlighting this in the exam, you should highlight the bullet points in 3 different colours just to make it really, really clear what examples and what sources match up to what when you're then writing it out. So for pensioner poverty, if I go up here to my sources, I can see this black line here, right? I'm just going to highlight that blue because I know that relates to pensioner poverty. Whereas I'm going to highlight this one here red because that relates to children. And that means I know which stat from this source matches up with which bullet point. Another good example here. So I know children is highlighted red. This whole table is about the percentage of children in poverty. So that whole table can be red. Whereas, I can ignore these ones. I can ignore these ones because that's nothing about pensioners or children. That one is about gender, so nothing about pensioners and children. Nothing about pensioners and children here. There's one about child poverty. So there's one about child poverty, so I can do that red, nice and easy. So we can see stuff about the overall. So we've got what's about the overall, we've got some about gender again. We've got household income there. We've got one here about pensioners again, okay? So you can see this one is pensioners. So in the white group, pensioners are the highest group in poverty. Okay, whereas in the black group they're the smallest, and in the Asian group they're joint with working age adults. So that then is our 2 things that we can use for pensioner poverty. There's only 2, so it's not a lot. So if we look at this here, pensioners are the lowest group living in poverty. Right, there are more children and more working age adults in poverty. So pensioner problems clearly still a problem. There's more than 10%. However, they are the group that's least affected. With the exception of the white group here as well, pensioners aren't the biggest group in the other 2 categories. So let's start writing this. The conclusion then. I can't just write there's a link between pensioners and poverty. That's wrong. That doesn't actually give me any information. But what I can write is one conclusion I can make about pensioner poverty is that pensioners are the group least likely to experience poverty, or pensioners are one of the groups least likely to experience poverty in comparison to others. Source C shows that pensioners have lower rates of poverty than children and working age adults. Source B shows that in ethnic groups, with the exception of white, pensioners are the least likely to be in poverty. Overall, this shows that when compared with children, working age adults, children and working age adults, pensioners are almost half as likely to be in poverty. Now that almost half is a really good way of just showing, look, I understand this, okay? That's how much less likely they are to be in poverty. And that's how we would do one of these questions. So we would just do exactly that for each bullet point, and then an overall conclusion about the extent of poverty, where we would just use any two facts that we've not used so far to really hammer home that point. The final source question is a reliability question. And the challenge with this question is that it's only worth 8 marks. You only have around 20 minutes to complete it, but it requires background knowledge. So unlike other questions where you're just using the sources, you need some understanding of modern studies content in order to be able to answer this question. The main purpose is you're going to be asked to judge the reliability of 3 different sources. And the reason you need some background knowledge is because you need to know before you go in what type of source you would consider reliable. So for example, a reliable source would be the government website. Now, government figures are all checked, they're all official, they all come from certain sources, and you're told what those sources are. Therefore, they are reliable. Another reliable source would be something along the lines of an interview with an expert. So if you were reading a medical article, and the medical article was based on the words or opinions of a doctor, then because the person being interviewed is qualified, you could consider them an expert. This would go as the same for crime, if it was a judge or a police officer. It would go the same for education, if it was a teacher or a professor. So it's very important to consider who is the source coming from. The best way to decide if someone's reliable is to first start with who, okay? Who is behind the source? If it's the government, reliable. If it's an expert, reliable. If it's a newspaper or a TV studio, then potentially it may not be reliable. So for example, if it's BBC, the BBC cannot be guaranteed to be reliable, however, they do promise to attempt to be unbiased. Whereas GB News would not attempt to be unbiased. They are known for being biased. The second big point of bias would be newspapers. So certain newspapers like The Guardian are known for having left-wing bias. Other newspapers like the Daily Mail are known for having right-wing bias. So usually newspapers will be biased, okay? It's just very difficult to tell sometimes what way that bias will go. But normally, if it is so The Telegraph, The Guardian, they're normally a more reliable newspaper. They will have some bias, however, they will try to print facts, and they've got a good reputation for that. Whereas newspapers that have something like Daily in it, Daily Mail, Daily Record, right, they are unreliable. Daily Express. The only really big example of a newspaper being absolutely unreliable would be The Sun. Okay, so if you ever get The Sun, it is known for telling lies, it is known for being unreliable, it is known for bias. Okay, and that's a really, really well-known one and a real famous one. The Sun is not biased left or right wing. The Sun is just biased to whatever the public opinion is. So if the public really support the Conservatives, so will The Sun. If they really support Labour, so will The Sun. They will jump ship and side with whoever they think is going to win. So it's important to know that. Right? Other sources include leaflets and pamphlets from organisations. So if you've got a pressure group or a charity and they're saying, here's evidence about this big problem we've got in society, then of course that's biased. They'll try to convince you that's a problem. So it might be true, right? It might be a good cause, it might be something you agree with, but it doesn't change the fact that the source of information is biased and trying to manipulate you with the way they're using the information. Another good example is political parties. Political parties, again, will provide information such as the Green Party to voters, but this will be biased. They will be trying to convince you to vote for them. So they will be using bias, and it's important to be able to recognise that. Right? Knowing those basics, okay? So knowing the really basic sources you might face will give you a bit of an advantage. But so will the structure. Okay? And this structure is quite self-explanatory because we're not picking random bits of information from different sources. This time we're just going one source at a time, judging if it's reliable, and providing two pieces of evidence. So source A is reliable as reason 1. Source A is also reliable as piece of evidence 2. Source B is unreliable as piece of evidence 1. Source B is unreliable as piece of evidence 2. And after you've done that for A, B and C, we finally reach our overall judgment. So overall, source A is the most reliable because you then compare it to source B or whatever one you've chosen. Okay, so if you choose source B as the most reliable, you compare it first to source A, then you would compare it to source C. Tell me it's more reliable because. So source B is more reliable than source A because. Source B is also more reliable than source C as. So you choose one, whatever one you think is the most reliable, the most trustworthy, and you compare it to the other two and state exactly why you think that one is more reliable than the others. So a really common one might be the date. So the most recent one, the most up-to-date source, that one's the most reliable. So you might say source C is more reliable than source A because source C was written in 2023 and source A was written in 2018. Source C is also more reliable than source B as source C was written 3 years newer, 3 years fresher than source B, meaning the information is more relevant now. Okay, so that's a really good way to compare that final bit. Let's look at the question though, to see what kind of things we're going to be making judgments on. So you can see question 3 in our source paper is our reliability. Okay, and for source A, we have a crime and justice survey by the Scottish Government, right? So that's by the Scottish Government, so we can consider that potentially will be pretty reliable. Source B is the Herald, okay, so it's a newspaper. So we know right away that maybe that will not be reliable because newspapers can be biased. But it's not just a newspaper, it's Scotland's leading newspaper, as you can see, and it's the newspaper. So there's a chance that might actually be pretty reliable. Source 3, or source C, sorry, the last one's a pressure group, meaning they're probably going to try and influence you, meaning they are going to be less reliable than the other two. So the one we'll do is we will do source B, okay? Let's examine this and decide exactly why it is reliable or why it could be considered unreliable. Right, first thing is the fact that it's the leading newspaper. So we've already highlighted that. That sounds pretty good. Like, I would trust the leading newspaper if I was looking for information. The second thing we can see is that they have quoted figures. So they've quoted the figures and they have also quoted paramedics. But where do those figures come from? So I have no idea where those figures come from. So I think that is an unreliable point then, because I do not know whatsoever where those information comes from. Like, they're making this claim that 1,000 underage drinkers a year are taken to hospital, but how do I possibly know that's true? I can't see them telling me this is where we got this information. I can also see the date, right? There's two different bits that tell me the date. The fact that it's repeated twice kind of does highlight to you that might be worth thinking about and that might be important. So if we look at the date, it's in 2014, right? That's a long time ago. A lot's changed since 2014 when it comes to alcohol. That one's also 2014. This one here's 2018. So the date here is much, much longer, much further ago than the other ones. So that's pretty problematic. So if I'm looking at this now, if we make this red and this red, because they are, there is much more red here than there is blue. So if there's more red, it's probably unreliable, right? So let's start typing up what an answer would look like. Source B is unreliable as the information given in the Herald newspaper article is never shown where it actually came from, and the statistics are not given a source. Okay, so we don't know where those statistics came from. They're never given a source. That's a big problem. It is also unreliable as the article was written in 2014, and these figures could have changed massively in the last, and this question was done in 2021, so it would be the last 7 years, but we will, because it's 2023, we'll write the last 9 years. Okay, so be specific when you're saying that. Okay, so be specific and say that this is the amount of time that's passed. Then overall, despite being a leading, that's what it says in the actual source, so we quote it, newspaper, the source B is unreliable as it is out of date and doesn't reveal where the information comes from. Okay, so we're saying it's unreliable, we're saying why, we're being strong, we're kind of giving it something, we're saying, yeah, it's a leading newspaper, so we're addressing that problem, but then we're being strong by saying, well, actually overall it's not reliable because it's out of date and it's not clear where the information comes from. Right, and that's a paragraph for reliability. Okay, the harder bit for reliability is when we get to the end. So the end where we have to choose to do our comparison. Right, so in this case we know source B is unreliable. So say I was comparing source A. Source A is the most reliable as, and what we would do is if we go back to the question, we can see where information in source A comes from. The survey is based on these interviews. So source A is more reliable than source B as it makes it clear the information comes from interviews. Source A is more reliable than source C as the information comes from the Scottish Government and not a pressure group, and the government will not be biased in the figures that they're using, whereas the pressure group is just using one man's opinion. That then is how to do a reliability question. So, the final section of this exam preparation video is all about essay structure. Now, essay structure is one of the most important parts of higher modern studies because it's where the vast majority of your marks in the exam will come from. In total in the exam, there will be 2 20-mark essays and 1 12-mark essay. This makes up your paper 1, so a total of 52 marks. Overall, this is worth just over 50% of the entire grade when we include the assignment and the source questions. So it's very, very important that you get this section right. The struggle with this section is it's the hardest one to prepare for because it includes the most content. Now, as you know, we look at 3 different sections of the course in higher modern studies. The section we look at are crime and the law, democracy in the United Kingdom, and the world power. And our world power is the USA. We will not focus on any content in this video because the differences with the content are huge and we would not be able to cover them all. What we'll instead look at is the basic structure we use for a modern studies essay and some of the kind of top tips and top things to avoid the traps that students usually fall into. Overall, in terms of timing, you've got 40 minutes for a 20-mark essay. That is a lot of time. The best way to think about that is you've got 5 minutes at the start, okay? You get your first 5 minutes, and that's to do your introduction, which is only really a couple of sentences long, your introduction, and basically come up with a plan. What's your essay going to look like? So your introduction should just be 2 sentences. Sentence 1, rewording the question. Take the question, write it out in your own words, make it clear exactly what you're talking about. And then sentence 2, refer to your factors. What are your paragraphs in your essay going to be about? It's a perfect way to get your thoughts on paper and start planning out what comes next. Then you've got about 8 minutes, okay, per paragraph. So you've got half an hour, okay, 32 minutes to do your 4 paragraphs. And that leaves you with about 3 minutes for your conclusion, okay? Or if you do your introduction in 3 minutes, about 5 minutes for your conclusion. So your conclusion, again, is just answering the question. It's worth 4 marks, so it should be about 4 sentences long, but the main points are that you need to take whatever the question is and make sure you address it, okay? You cannot just write a generic conclusion which talks about the factors or talks about the topic. It needs to directly answer whatever the question is. For a 20-mark essay, you should be aiming for 4 perial paragraphs. A 12-mark essay should aim for 3 perial paragraphs. In terms of perial then, we start with our point. For your point, all you're doing is stating your factor and using the wording of the question. Now that's incredibly important. It can't just be a generic point. You need to use the exact wording of the question. You should follow that by explaining what your point actually is. Like, what is your factor? Whenever you're writing a modern studies essay, you should always imagine the person you're talking to has no idea about your topic, right? You are the expert. Only you know. Only you can sell this idea to them, okay? No one else understands what you're about to impart on them. Your explanation should be followed by an example, a real-life, modern example that backs up the point you're making. Okay, so whatever point you're making, you need to hit me with a statistic or a case study that really shows, yes, this is a cause of crime. Yes, this is a method pressure groups use. Yes, this is a way Parliament is able to influence decision making. Your example should always be followed by some sort of analytical comment. So this shows. Explain to me why you've used that statistic. Why does that statistic connect to your factor? Why does it matter? Okay, is it significant? Is it insignificant? I really need to know these when I'm reading this because I need to know what you understand. And your analytical comment is your best chance to show me that you grasp the content. It should be followed by a rebuttal then, a counter argument, a however statement, okay? You've told me all about one thing. You've told me why the Marxist theory is an explanation of why crime happens. Now I need you to tell me why some people would criticise it. What is the problem with the Marxist theory? Why shouldn't I believe it? Why shouldn't I support it? Explain it, okay? Make it really clear. Why is that problematic? Okay, why would some people criticise your factor? Why would some people disagree with your point? Take your time to do this. Make it really strong, because if you make this strong enough, it can count as an analytical comment. You're essentially given a disadvantage. You're making a comparison between your point and your rebuttal. After you've made your rebuttal, it's really important you support your rebuttal with an example, okay? Again, you're proving to me why this is a valid criticism. So you've already given me a statistic, now give me a counter statistic. Maybe in your first example, you've told me the cost of prisons and how expensive prisons are. Now you could be telling me the cost of electronic tagging and comparing them, okay? Showing me that one is much cheaper, therefore it's much better for the taxpayer, it's got a much lower socio-economic impact, okay? There's some sort of example or statistic that compares to your original. Here's the reason you shouldn't trust that first one. Here's the reason that first one might not be accepted by everyone. And then finally, a link, okay? Summarise your factor and answer the question, okay? Whatever your factor is, whether it is the Marxist theory, whether it is voting in Parliament, you need to summarise exactly what that means and why it is a response to the question. Why does it have influence? Why does it explain crime? Okay, make it exactly clear. Here's an example. Let's have a look, okay? So, in terms of what the paragraph should actually look like, right, we will use this question here. To what extent does crime have a social and economic impact on wider society? The key words in that question are crime. So we know exactly what topic we're in. Impact. We know what we need to evaluate. We need to say, yes, it does have an impact. No, it doesn't have an impact. Social and economic. So we're not just talking about one. We're talking about social, which is relationships. We're talking about economic, which is finances, money. And then finally, wider society. We're not talking about victims. We're not talking about families. We're talking about society as a whole. Okay? So that's the key words to think about in the question. And every single question always has some keywords. That's the kind of things you need to mention in your points, your rebuttals, your links, your introduction, your conclusion. So take some time and identify those. One way crime has a social and economic impact on wider society is through the financial cost. So our factor there is financial cost. And we're using the exact wording of the question to craft our point. Then we're just explaining why crime has a financial cost. So we're bringing in government, we're bringing in prisons and policing and taxpayers. So there's our wider society, government and taxpayers. Then our statistic, our example. Crime costs the government around $3 billion a year. Then we're analysing it. $3 billion a year is a lot of money. So that's a huge impact on wider society. It's not just a slight impact, it's not a small impact, it's a huge impact. We're making it as clear as possible. This is massive, this matters, okay? That money could be spent elsewhere. So because of crime and money being spent on crime, services such as education and healthcare are missing out. Right, we're making that really, really clear that the impact is large. Then we need to provide our counter-argument, our rebuttal, okay? So our however is that, yes, crime does have a huge impact, but new policies have been introduced to try and reduce that cost. One of these new policies, as I'll explain, and that's the National Business Crime Centre. So that's focus is to reduce business crime and therefore reduce the amount of money the government is spending trying to combat crime. One thing the Business Centre is doing is offering free cybersecurity training to businesses and staff in order to reduce fraud. So here's another example. Here's one specific thing that organisation is doing in order to try and reduce the impact. This shows then the government and other agencies are working to reduce the impact on crime. They're tackling common crimes that cost large amounts of money. Okay, so this shows, we're just explaining why the example matters. And then finally, we're going to use the exact wording of the question for our link. Crime has a huge social impact on communities and businesses. That's our wider society. But it also has a massive financial impact. There's both aspects of the questions addressed on the taxpayer. Okay, even though we've introduced recent initiatives to reduce that. The most important thing to remember at all times is answer the question. That's what matters most here, okay? You need to make sure whatever the question's asking you, that you're actually answering it. So to what extent does crime have a social and economic impact on wider society? If we go back to the answer, a huge social impact and a massive financial impact. So a direct addressing and answering of the question is absolutely vital, okay? I'm just going to leave for your essays some key points, okay? Don't use generic responses. Read your point to make sure it makes sense. Your rebuttals are criticism. Your overall conclusion should compare your factors. It should compare financial cost to the other impacts of crime, such as the damage to property, such as the damage to an area, such as the stigma the areas might get. And then finally, your introduction is a plan. Use it as such. All of these will help you prepare for not just your FAB, but your exams in May.